Welcome everyone. My name is Aaron Connelly. I am a research fellow at the IISS in Southeast Asian politics and foreign policy, and we're delighted to have with us both Professor Tyrell Haberkorn from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Dr. Greg Raymond from the SDSC at the Australian National University to discuss the recent demonstrations in Thailand and the political uncertainty that has developed as a result of those demonstrations. We'd like to keep this conversation conversational. And so I'll ask a series of questions of our panelists, and then we will open it up to Q&A. If you would please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. I'll then read from those questions to our panelists. I would just suggest that because I'll be reading from those questions and then also trying to pay attention to our panelists, please keep your questions brief. If you write a very long paragraph, I won't have time to read it and I probably won't ask your question. So it's sort of unusual for a think tank event, but please try to keep your questions brief. I should remind everyone that this event is public, is on the record, and as you can see at the top left of your screen, a recording is being prepared that will be published on the IISS website at a later date. You have both of the panelists biased, and so I won't go into their very extraordinary credentials to speak to this subject. But just get straight into the conversation. And I wonder, Tyrell, if I could start with you, could you tell us just at a very general level, what do these protesters want? Oh, I'm sorry, I need to unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. So at their core, the protests that are taking place now follow from the incomplete transition from military rule after the March 2019 elections. Of course, officially, the National Council for Peace and Order ceased to exist, but in actual practice, in terms of who sits in the highest seats of government, what policies are being implemented, the influence of the junta remains very strong. These protests are a direct challenge to that, and in fact are what I see as a very fulsome attempt by citizens to create the space to participate fully and wholly in democracy, to create a democracy, and for all citizens to have access to participation in that democracy. With that in mind, there are three key demands that they're asking for. The first is to dissolve parliament and hold elections. The second is to draft a new constitution that is a democratic constitution. And then the third is to stop intimidating and harassing citizens, which has really grown pretty significantly over the past month of intensified protests. I would note that there are three really important aspects of these protests, particularly as we think about the long trajectory over the last 15 years of political contention in Thailand. The first is their leadership. These are protests that are not being led by a political party or by long political operatives of other kinds. They're being led by youth, by university students and secondary students. The second, they're incredibly broad. The protests are taking place in Bangkok as well as around the country and are focused on these three demands, but a range of other related demands, including women's rights, LGBTQ rights, issues of ending human rights abuses in the South. And then the third is the sheer creativity and energy of those in the streets. They're drawing on a broad repertoire of both historical Thai symbols as well as international symbols. And over the past month, for anybody who's been following the protests closely, there's a protest almost every day. There's at least one a week, and then almost every day. When I wake up in the morning in Madison, the first thing I do is to see what happened the night before. So it's a very exciting moment.
I wonder, I think a lot of foreign observers have this sense that we've been hearing about protests in Thailand for about 12 years now, but these protests do look very different. And I wonder if you could go into a little bit more detail about what the protests used to look like before the NCPO took power in 2014, and what these protests look like now, and because the aesthetics of the protests are very different.
So that's the chronology that you offer is a really useful one. I would say there's sort of three moments that we could think of. We could think of 2005 to 2014. So from the first coup, well, it was actually the 12th, but the first in recent years on the 19th of September 2000, actually it was 2006, but protests began in 2005, to the NCPO's coup, where street politics and the cycle of governments was dominated by protests between yellow shirts and red shirts, the sort of the long discussed color-coded Thai politics. Very, very briefly and far too broadly, the yellow shirts, royalist nationalists, the red shirts, populist Democrats. And they were locked in sort of a back and forth for those years. Once the 2014 coup happened, that contention, that tension between royalist nationalism and populist democracy didn't cease. It was still present, but it wasn't in the streets anymore. The NCPO very, very quickly shut that all down. Instead, what happens during the 5 years of NCPO rule was a continuous but a very small group of students, labor activists, writers, journalists, and others who were protesting the military regime. But it was a very small group, less than 1,000 people, I would say, who were all active. Some of whom now have positions in either the former Future Forward Party or the Move Forward Party. What has happened since the official end of the NCPO, the elections and the official end of the NCPO, is an entirely new group of people have come into the streets. First of all, they're new generationally. The young people who are protesting now are people who grew up within this context of 15 years of political contention, but they weren't part of it. Their parents might have been. I think many of them actually, their parents were, but they were not participants. So they're new, in a sense, new political actors. They also are not, they don't hold to either the yellow royalist nationalism or the red populist democracy. They're calling for something wholly different, a different kind of democracy that is not beholden to old ideas. And the numbers is the other place where this is really striking. These protests so far are certainly the largest since the coup, but I think they have the potential to be the largest since 1982, since 1973, and to draw in a much wider swath of the country.
Thanks, Tyrell. Greg, could we go to you now? And maybe you can tell us, how has the government reacted, not just to these protests, but since we've been discussing a little bit the transition to the elections last year in 2019, how has the government responded to that new challenge from the Future Forward Party and then from these demonstrations beginning in February of this year? Sorry, Greg, you've got to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'll start again. I think with this government, I think what we've seen is that they had a belief that they could take the country backwards. They took power in 2014. They introduced a policy of, return the Thai smile, at the same time as introducing arbitrary detention and so forth, people being taken into barracks for 3 days to have their attitudes readjusted. And then we saw a process of devising a new constitution, the author of which on the second attempt was Michai Ruchapan, who's a constitutional lawyer who drafted constitutions in the 1980s and was very good at devising constitutions in which the military would have a major role. The so-called Krungpai Prachatipatai Krungpai, or half-baked democracy. Now, my view is that the military thought that would simply achieve the job. And I think Prayuth, having been a soldier his entire career, believes that once an order is given, then people fall in line. And I think what's happened now, he's tried to take Thailand back to the past, and he's running to the future. He's colliding with a new generation who have no reason or see no reason to abide by the orders of a dictator. And I think they believe they can think for themselves. And I think this government is struggling to accommodate that reality. They are really increasingly, in a way, out of touch or detached from reality. And I think that's happening on a number of fronts. I mean, you see that most clearly with General Apirat and his attempt to label these protesters as people who chang-chat, who hate the nation. And his response was very elegantly dismantled by one of the future forward leaders, Biabut, who simply said, well, what is the nation for General Apirat? It's a place which has no people. He has no idea of what chat means. He simply wants a neutral zone where people abide by orders. And so they're struggling, I think, there's an ontological, challenge here for the military. What's going on with these protesters, and I just add a little bit to what Tyrell said about their very interesting characteristics, is that they are challenging not only the political elite, but they're challenging Thailand's system of education, which has been based around rote learning and a kind of blind acceptance of authority. And these students are no longer prepared to accept that. They don't want an educational system which simply treats them as vessels to be filled. They want to be taught critical thinking. And in the absence of that type of education, they're finding their own sources of knowledge via the internet. So they are quite different to Thai citizens of previous generations. I'm not going to say that they're, all generations have been quiescent, but clearly they've not been. But this group, I guess they're challenging some norms of Thai culture even. I think one of the interesting things at one of the demonstrations was the Thai education minister attempted to address the students, and he wanted to simply, I guess, assert his authority, and the students told him to wait in line. I mean, this is quite extraordinary that they're not prepared to accept this kind of norm of that's built into Thai culture, where Thai manners is built around knowing what is high and what is low. You have to know tisong and titam. You have to know what's high and low. Now, these students are in a way challenging some of those basic norms of Thai society, and I think and espousing equality as a very important value. I think that's quite important. So, and just to finish on that point, one of the things that I think really distinguishes them from the red shirts is that they are emphasizing principles, not persons, not people. I think, although I agree with Tyrell that the red shirts were certainly sympathetic to democracy, I think that was also much of the time a stalking horse for wanting to bring back their leader, Thaksin Shinawatra. And many people were particularly interested in him as an alternative source of charisma and benefit. But I don't see this generation as looking for an alternative leader. They are firmly supporting a set of principles, which is quite a different kind of protest. So at the moment, I don't think the government has the answers to really deal with this protest movement. And I think it's difficult for them to use force because the protesters so far are themselves very peaceful. The problem with the red shirts is that they started to dally in the use of force. They had an armed wing. They had ex-military people on their side, and that raised, that escalated the situation. I don't see the signs of this protest movement doing that. So it's an interesting situation for the government. It's not easy for them to move on them.
Greg, I want to come back to the topic of violence later, but I wonder if you could speak to the specific question of some of the other pressures that are on the government alongside the protests. The government created, or the NCPO drafted, a constitution that was designed to return a prime minister who was favored by the military, which was appointed most of the 250-person Senate, but it has had trouble maintaining a majority in the lower house and therefore passing a budget and maintaining supply and confidence. Why did the government disband, why did the courts disband the Future Forward Party earlier this year, which I think was the first event that really led to widespread or to larger popular protests back in February? and how did that affect the government's approach in Parliament?
So why did they disband Future Forward? I mean, I think what you've seen since 2014 is a regime which is exhibiting the style of government that Lee Morgan Besser has called sophisticated authoritarianism. It looks as if there's aspects of both Myanmar and Cambodia and what's been happening in Thailand since 2014. I mean, judicial activism, or I guess use of the judiciary as a tool to silence opponents was occurring, before 2014, and it's increasingly become a tool, a favoured tool to disarm opponents, but it's clearly crept up a notch. Why did they do that? I think they thought they could get away with it, and I think they hadn't. There's still a lack of understanding of the generational difference, and they thought they could do that and roll on. And I think they thought they were clever in using the courts as a mechanism by which to dissolve the party, ban its leaders, and so forth. But I think they've really underestimated the degree to which students were invested and young people were invested in that party. So, they've been seeking to, implement this form of sophisticated authoritarianism, which gives Thailand the trappings, the external appearances of a democracy, and yet is firmly under the control of the regime. And I think they believe that they've done that with the 2017 constitution, but it always was not 100% guaranteed. It was only a very, at the end of the day, it was quite possible that Prayuth wouldn't have won. Poor Thai committed some grievous errors, particularly by nominating the princess, which took one of their proxy parties out of the picture, and those votes, some of those votes flowed to the government's party. So they were able to assemble. At the end of the day, they only won 117 seats or so forth, but they were able to cobble together a coalition. It's interesting to speculate. A lot of the protesters at the moment are saying, well, this government has been able to take power with the support of the 250 unelected senators. That's not quite right in that there was never a joint sitting to bring Prayuth, to elect Prayuth. He did get the coalition of 250, the majority of the lower house, but he needed the support of two big parties. One was Phumjai Thai and the other one was the Democrats. Now, it's interesting to speculate what might have happened behind the scenes. It might have been a case of, well, you better come across, otherwise we will use the Senate. And that may well have been, the case. And certainly people are of the belief now, it's almost like a narrative that, Prayuth did use the 250 senators to take power, and certainly they are in his pocket for any future election, which is why people are unhappy with the constitution. But look, at the end of the day, they wanted to walk this fine line between looking like a democracy, but controlling the picture either through the courts or through the constitution. And that was never 100% guaranteed. And it's looking increasingly shaky, I think.
Tyrell, I want to give you an opportunity to comment on what Greg's just said, but I also want to ask you about how COVID has affected all of this. Obviously, Thailand's heavily dependent on tourism for parts of its economy, and it's been hit hard. Sorry, Tyrell?
Your sound went out for a moment.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Great. Yeah, obviously, Thailand's economy has been hit really hard by COVID-19. Large sections of the economy or a large part of the economy is dependent upon tourism, which has stopped. The government seems to have struggled to manage the economic fallout of the pandemic, even as it's had a very good record, sort of a world-class record, frankly, in managing the public health aspects of the pandemic, as far as we know. I just wanted to ask you, how has that affected the government's situation and its ability to feel as though it's in control of this situation?
I think COVID is incredibly significant to the present moment for the government and for actually the existence of the protests in two ways. For the government, the ongoing destruction of the economy is yet another way in which the Prayuth government is becoming very, very tenuous and unstable. I think in particular, there are those, I imagine those who are in this, some of those who are in the streets and who may go out into the streets will be those who are economically affected. So people who have lost their jobs or have watched dispossession happen around them, I think that's quite significant. I think it's also possible that some of the large financial interests in Thailand that were quite content throughout the NCPO years to offer their tacit support to the military junta. If their business becomes significantly affected, they may withdraw support as well. So I think it's in a general sense, it makes the government very unstable. I think there's another way that we might want to think about it also, at least to pose the question, perhaps unable to answer it at this stage. But looking at protests, both in Thailand and also in the US, the broad social and economic effects of the pandemic have been one of the factors that have led people to begin to dissent. And I think that's also the case in Thailand. It's not in Thailand, in contrast to the US, it's not that people feel like their government hasn't been keeping them safe. It has, but it's kept them safe at the cost of their, the economy and their potential economic future. And so I think that's absolutely a factor that made all of a sudden, once the protests in the streets in Thailand began again, once the period, the March, April, May period of really serious lockdown was lifted. And I think it's a big piece of it is precisely the effect on the economy that is taking place.
And is there a prospect for these? You mentioned earlier you thought there might be a prospect for the protests growing over time. Could they potentially grow demographically? Could you see older people getting involved in the protests in a bigger way? And how would the economic pressures affect that calculation?
I think absolutely. I mean, one of the things that has been fascinating that has happened, I would say, in the last 3 weeks, is that a number of people, both individuals, sort of ordinary people, as well as more prominent singers, actors, et cetera, who had either not been political before or in some cases had been affiliated with the yellow shirt movement, very publicly came out to support students. There's also, I unfortunately, of course, have only been able to watch live feeds of the protests. I haven't been able to go to any of them, but there is a wide range of people in the audience, age-wise. And I would say class-wise also. So the leadership is young, and in a sense, not necessarily middle class, but for those who are university students, certainly either on upwardly mobile class-wise. But those who are joining them are quite broad, and I think that will continue. I think as there are follow-on economic effects, just looking historically in Thailand at protests, around the world at protests, it almost always leads people to dissent when they start to be worried about filling their bellies, paying their rent, paying their bills. They call for change.
I wonder, Greg, if we could speak a little bit about the August 10th protests, which Tyrell's given us the overview of the 3 primary demands of the demonstrators, but the August 10th protest introduced a number of other demands and appeared to break certain very significant taboos in Thai political discourse. How do you think the introduction of those demands affected popular support for the demonstrators or for the government?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question. Just before I answer that, I had a couple of questions on the economy, a couple of points on the economy. I think it is incredibly important. The Thai economy was drifting even before COVID-19. It was anemic in its growth, 2% to 3% growth, which really isn't enough to give people jobs and hope for the future. Now the economy's shrunk 8%. And what's happened is the government appears to really be quite shambolic. They cannot even appoint a minister to hold that job and to, I guess, enunciate a vision or a pathway out of this crisis and to, I guess, begin to position Thailand, more competitively, because Thailand, was positioned very well coming out of the Cold War period when its neighbours had become battlefields and were struggling to simply really rebuild themselves. Now they are, Thailand's facing Vietnam, which is becoming an alternative source of beginning to attract foreign investment, which once would have gone to Thailand. So really there needs to be a lot of big thinking done. Now, Prayuth sacked Somkit, or Somkit had to resign because of the internal mechanics of the Palang Pracharat party. And he's been unable to fill that position. Just this week, one of the newly appointed ministers resigned, and we're still beginning to see more details about that, but it may have been because he wasn't playing along with some of the oligarchic practices which have characterized the management of the Thai economy over several years. Now, coming back to the 10 August protest, I think it's important to note that these protesters are drawing their inspiration from a spectrum of different sources. And some of the protesters, I think, are very interested in the views of some of the more strident, I guess you would say, critics of the monarchy, such as Ajahn Pawin in Tokyo, and Ajahn Somsak in Paris. And these are influential, but they're not influential across the board. There are many other protesters who, I guess, would perhaps agree with some reform in order to ensure the monarchy, I guess, works within a frame of law. But on the other hand, they're not going to put that first in terms of their demands. So there's also a kind of tactical decision-making going on here. And I think with the leaders of Future Forward, they've decided that they want to focus on the military and the constitution. They don't want to bring the monarchy necessarily into the frame immediately, or in a very, they know they need to walk around this topic extremely carefully. So there's a spectrum of views. I think there was a national intake of breath. You could almost hear, the whole country sort of pause and freeze once they knew what had happened at Thammasat at that protest. But I think there's been gradually a realization that, okay, we have a spectrum of views. Thailand is a country which needs to be able to manage a spectrum of views. We cannot go back to uniformity, and we don't want to see violence. And so I think there's been a kind of view that if they're going to deal with that type of expression, it's going to be done quietly through detention and arrests, not through unleashing of, I guess, proxy forces to conduct acts of violence. And I think, that's a very positive sign so far, and I hope that remains the case, that both the government and people were shocked about what occurred at Thammasat, but they have controlled themselves and controlled the degree of vigor with which they've sought to, I guess, either punish or control the protesters who are espousing those kinds more, which some people would call extreme views, which I think, those of us in the West would not think are extreme views whatsoever. But for Thailand, of course, on this taboo topic, it's difficult. Of course, there are others who, such as the solicitor, who has expressed views about the monarchy in very, I guess, calm, legal, thoughtful terms that are not regarded as all provocative, that are similar to previous critics or previous public intellectuals who've talked about the need for the monarchy to reform in order to maintain its viability. And I'm talking here of people like Sulak Siwarak, who for a long time has said that the monarchy has to reform if it's going to survive. So there's a spectrum of views. There are many people who would agree that there needs to be reform, but how you go about this and the kind of language you use is something which Thai people are still working through.
I wanted to come back to this issue of violence, because you suggested earlier that there is a fear that some of the uncertainty in Thailand could lead to a kind of violent reaction. And of course, in 1976 at Thammasat, there was a violent reaction to protests of this nature. What do you think the likelihood is of a violent reaction? and how you're a specialist in the Thai military, the Thai armed forces. How do you think the armed forces are thinking about these protests right now? Do you think that there's likely to be some debate within the armed forces about how to handle the protests?
Certainly there would be debate. The armed forces, I think, are in an interesting position. Certainly, I think if there is violence between protesters, they will see that as a pretext to get involved. So there is the possibility of conservative forces, agents provocateurs, the legendary Murtisam, the third hand who appears at large protests and causes a violent event. That is a pattern which has been repeated over many years in Thailand. At the moment, I think one of the tactics of the youth protesters which makes this less probable is that they are not doing sit-ins. They are not inhabiting spaces for long periods of time. They're using a flash mob technique where they congregate, and they can do that through social media. They congregate and they disperse. They go home. They stay at home at their parents' house. And so the potential for clashes is lessened perhaps because of that. The military's role, of course, is interesting now because some of the changes which have happened to the dispersal of forces in the city itself are very interesting. These are forces which have come from the orders which have come from the palace to withdraw certain army units. A number of army units were withdrawn to the perimeter of the city, and at the same time the King's Own, the Royal Security Command, has increased in strength, giving it a considerable degree of advantage if there was to be any need to mobilize military force in the city. So that is a new factor. But if the protests remain as they are, dispersed, transient, national, rather than the type of very static protests that we saw in leading up to the tragedies of 2010, then I wonder how whether or not the military will have as much opportunity to get involved. This may remain something where the police remain the main tool of the military, pursuing students, going in, taking photographs of them, intimidating them that way, seeking, I guess, to, arrest some under the legislation of sedition, which is interesting. They're not using lèse majesté. These appear to be the tools of choice for the moment.
Carol, do you want to come in on that question as well?
Sure. One actually really important thing to note is that for the first time yesterday, the first two protesters were remanded to detention at the Bangkok remand prison. There's been a cycle of arrests and releases over the past 3 weeks that has been sort of fascinating and intriguing and concerning to watch, where the police have arrested some activists from arrest lists that they have that are known. They're often held overnight in a police station, and then the next day the court will release them. Yesterday, before a 4-day long weekend, the lawyer Anon Nampa, who I think is the lawyer who Greg was referring to, and then Panupong Jatnog, a student activist from Ramkhamhaeng University, were sent for detention at the Bangkok remand prison. I think this is incredibly significant. It is the first time that any of the protesters have been remanded to prison, and especially doing it over a 4-day long weekend, which means the earliest they could potentially be released. At this point, they haven't been charged, they've just been accused. So under the Criminal Procedure Code, they can't actually be held for very long. It's worth paying close attention to. I also would note that if we look at the NCPO period, and in particular since 2016, there has been the use of extrajudicial violence. There have been a series of extrajudicial killings and disappearances of critics of the regime. That is certainly something that activists are concerned about. Sometimes protests over the past couple of weeks, they've ended with someone ending their speech by saying, "I don't know if I'll be alive to speak to you next time, so if I die, please carry on my message." And I think every time I hear those words, I realize it's a very serious concern. This is not hyperbole. It's not exaggeration. It is possible. I share Greg's view that I think the conditions for a massacre are very different than they were even 10 years ago or 40 years ago. But I think the possibility of significant violence is there, and also paying attention to how the courts are being used. People could be, sedition. The sedition measure carries with it a potential 7-year sentence per count. So people could be sent away for very long periods of time. And even though that hasn't yet happened, it is worth paying attention to how activists were prosecuted, how red shirt activists were prosecuted after 2010, and how activists were prosecuted during the NCPO years. There could be very significant sentences handed down for expression. So there's a range of potentially sort of rights violation kinds of consequences.
Thanks, Tyrell. I want to ask one more question with a little bit more of an international dimension before we go to question and answer from our attendees. So if you do have a question and you're watching this, please feel free to type in your question now. We tend to get a lot of questions toward the very end of the seminar, and we can't get to all of them in that case. So feel free to start plugging your questions in now. But Tyrell, I wanted to ask you specifically about some of the international connections that the protesters have drawn. There's often been comparisons in the international media to the sort of the quote unquote leaderless way that the Hong Kong protests manifested themselves. Do you think those are valid comparisons? What actually is similar and what's different? And I know that you've spoken a little bit about similarities with Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. Could you speak about those as well? Sure.
I think there is, first on Hong Kong, there is, I think, significant similarity to the form of protest, the horizontal, I have a colleague who uses very smartly the term rhizomatic mode of organizing among protesters. This is also why I think the Prayuth regime will have a very hard time shutting down this protest. They can't just arrest 10 people and have the protest end. There are hundreds of people who will just come up in their place because it's being organized quite horizontally and in a very geographically dispersed way. So that, I think, is a real strength of the protests. And certainly, I think, as one borrowed and learned from watching how activists in Hong Kong were able to really prolong their protests before there was a really sharp crackdown. The other really intriguing borrowing that, as you mentioned, has been from Black Lives Matter. And it very early on in this wave of protests in early June, when Wanchalerm Satsaksit, the most recent of the exiled dissidents, he was disappeared from in front of his condominium in Phnom Penh. And his reported last words were, "I can't breathe." And I believe it was right around 10 days after George Floyd was killed in the United States. And the death of George Floyd was reported very widely in the Thai press, the independent, of course, in the the national press, but also widely in the independent media and taken up very broadly. And you saw in those early months of June, activists making comparisons between suppression and violence against Black people in the United States and the suppression of dissident views and individuals in Thailand. And I think in that sense, there's many differences between the two contexts, but simply that borrowing, the transnational borrowing is quite fascinating, as has been particularly you see it a lot on Twitter, which has been used quite widely by this movement, really actually for over a year. But there's amplification of struggles happening in Thailand by activists in particularly Hong Kong and Taiwan as part of the Milk Tea Alliance. And I think that's really useful. One thing that we actually neither Greg nor I mentioned that we should mention is that in the past month, often if you look at the hashtags that are trending on Twitter, the top hashtags in Thailand on Twitter, on many days they have been connected to the protests. That is a pretty remarkable phenomenon. And I think a lot of it is through not only the strength of domestic activists, but then support from their allies in other struggles in the region as well.
Greg, given that this is the case, that there is that protest movements in different countries appear to be drawing strength from each other, how do you think the Prayuth government or the RTA, the Royal Thai Army, how do you think that they're viewing those connections? Is this something that would make them more sympathetic to the way that Beijing has handled the Hong Kong protests? And how do you think this might affect, for instance, if we were to see a Biden administration in the United States that took a stronger view or a firmer view on human rights in Southeast Asia? How do you think it would affect Thailand's position amidst great power competition between the US and China?
Okay, so really a two-part question. How is Prayuth looking at China's handling of Hong Kong? I think reading Benjamin Zawaki's book about Thailand between China and the United States, it was interesting to see amongst some of the elites in Thailand talking about the virtues of a China model. Now, I don't think that that's really gained a huge amount of traction. I don't think Thais see themselves as going down the path of market Leninism, but if I could draw on the work of the American political scientist Dan Slater, who talked about protection pacts sponsoring the growth of security apparatus. And he always said that you didn't see that in Thailand because the communist insurgency was dispersed in the countryside, not in the city. But in 2010, we saw a very significant, I guess, not an insurgency, but a protest movement, a movement wanting to overthrow the order, you know, taking over large swaths of urban Bangkok and then deploying, you know, quite heavy weapons and using quite heavy violence. And I think at that point in time, some of the business elites in Thailand, as well as the military, began to see some virtue in a kind of China model. That is, you know, we should be able to use tools of repression in order to ensure that, you know, these key institutions of our country remain off limits and sacrosanct, and those in the business world are able to pursue their business without threat or fear of protest disruptions. So there is some sympathy, but at the same time, you know, there's also a huge kind of cognitive dissonance there between looking at China and its you know, ruling ideology and Thailand's you know, constitutional monarchy, and those things don't fit together too well. So you know, I think that kind of thinking goes a certain way, but not too far. And so, you know, at the end of the day, the soldiers always come back to calling themselves Democrats occasionally. You know, Prayuth at one stage said, "I have a democratic heart," and this is from a man who turned up when he was sworn in and refused to include allegiance to the Constitution when he gave his oath. So there's a real kind of there's a whole series of contradictions here. On the question of the Biden administration and American policy towards, I guess, Thai military dictators and juntas and so forth, I think this is an area fraught with risk for the United States. And this is coming out of the research that I did with John Blaxland on how Thais viewed the United States and the alliance. Because of the history of the United States in relation to Thailand and the view that at certain periods of time, the United States was prepared to prop up dictators, interfere in Thailand's political system, make or break leaders. It's an area which carries a lot of baggage. And so I think the United States has to be very selective about how it gets involved. It can be painted by nationalists as you know, supporting one side or, you know, looking to interfere. And this is a narrative which can really gain traction very easily. So I think it's better when the United States is very selective. I think the United States has done a great job on pushing Thailand to crack down on human trafficking. I think that's been, you know, that there's been real progress achieved there. But challenging the whole nature of the political system is a different kind of story. So I think while the United States under a Biden administration will of course feel sympathetic to the protesters, how they express that support needs to be very calibrated and very measured, in my view.
Tyrell, did you want to comment on that question as well?
No, I would have said what Greg just said.
Great. Well, maybe we can go to a question from Romain Kayol from, he's a consultant based in Tokyo. Thanks for these excellent presentations. There was a mention of the business oligarchy. How does big business, Thai Bev, CP, Central, and the like, look at the current political system? Are they in favor of the status quo despite the instability it creates, or do they favor change? Greg, what do you think?
Look, I think with business, they will favor the status quo, but when they see that change is inevitable, they will move quickly, is my view. I mean, there are 5 very large conglomerates that really dominate Thailand's business scene at the moment, and Jiren Pokapanda amongst them, Thai Bev, Central, a few others. Many of these are family-owned businesses. They're often Sino-Thai family-owned businesses, and they have grown up over decades to achieve their wealth and their influence. And their survival really depends on support from, I guess, the monarchy and the military, and that's been a pattern which goes back to, you know, the early 20th century. And they've been great supporters for the monarchy because there's been a quid pro quo. I mean, much of Bangkok and the Thai economy was built on the back of Chinese immigrants. And you know, now being Sino-Thai is something that people are very open and comfortable with, but at the same time, you know, you can occasionally see signs of still the potential for an anti-Sino-Thai narrative. That came out interestingly during the election when Thanatorn was actually attacked and criticised for being an ungrateful Sino-Thai and told to go and look at the experiences of other Sino-Thais in Indonesia who have been, you know, massacred at certain times. So the implication was he should be grateful to the monarchy. So these kinds of threads, sentiments do go on. Excuse me. You know, there is risk here, but I think that the businesses want a climate in which they can do business. Unfortunately, I think they're also comfortable with a non-competitive business environment, and this is something which the monarchy and the military, to some extent, have colluded in. And I think you know, perhaps they will favour the status quo simply because they're not really in favour of seeing more competition in some ways.
Tyrell, we have a question from Termsop Cheller Palanapap at ICES here in Singapore. What are your predictions on what will happen when the student protests rally at Thammasat University's Thap Praichan campus on 19 September? Specifically, do you expect them to return to the 10-point demand on monarchical reforms first announced at another Thammasat campus in Rangsit on 10 August? And should this be the case, what is your assessment on possible responses from the law enforcement authorities and the royalists?
That's a great question. I think I have to say I don't feel comfortable offering a prediction on what will happen on the 19th of September, just because we've still got 2 more weeks to see what kind of response from the authorities will already come in these weeks. Will there be many more people remanded to prison? I think whatever happens in the courts and in the police stations in the next 2 weeks will shape those protests very much. I do think that it is likely that the 10-point declaration, which for anybody who hasn't read it, it's been translated and is in English on the Bacha Thai website. I would urge viewers to read it because it is a very careful and well-reasoned statement. And so when watching the government's reaction, it's important to know what they were actually asking for. I think it is likely that activists will continue to reiterate those 10 demands. And the reason is that in the past 20 plus days since August 10th, they've continued to do so, even though at threat of arrest, at threat of violence. So I don't think people will give up those 10 demands very easily, which really, if I was going to put them in one sentence, it's to have a conversation about the place of the monarchy in the polity. That's what it is. That's what the demands are about. And I think that, Greg mentioned that you could feel sort of the shift when on August 10th. And I think, I think it is unlikely that shift can be undone. And so I don't think it's going to just disappear quietly. I think that date has now become an important date in Thai political history. If I was writing a chronology today, I would put all sorts of things on it. That's one of the things I would put on there. What it will mean in the long term, we'll have to wait and see on the 19th of September and beyond.
There's a question from James Crabtree at the Lee Kuan Yew School here in Singapore. Perhaps, Greg, you could take this one. Can you say something about Thanatorn? What has been his personal relationship with the protest? Is there the sense that the ban has been, on Future Forward, has been an effective measure in the sense that he is now a marginal political figure? Would you take issue with that characterization?
Look, I don't think he's marginal, but I don't ever think he's ever been, I guess, a dominant figure. He's been an important figure for expressing the desire for Thailand. The hashtag let my generation be the last. My generation be the last to see a coup. He articulated that. That was the platform for Future Forward, and I think he and Prayuth together have made really important contributions to this discourse. But I think Thanatorn, he didn't want to see a street movement. I mean, he was quite explicit in saying he wanted to take the fight up to the government in Parliament, and he wanted to restore the importance of Parliament as an institution for determining Thailand's future. And I think he was prepared to, be a very good parliamentarian. He was denied that chance. He was denied that opportunity, and I think that was difficult. And so I think in the end, he did begin to organise. He began to see that protests on the street were unavoidable. But at the same time, he has a deep understanding of Thailand's history of state-sanctioned violence and the deaths of protesters. And I think he's very sensitised to that and hasn't wanted to see a repeat of that. And that's why the tactics that they're using are very important, these flash mob protests, as a way of trying to minimise the risk, but they cannot avoid the risk entirely. So I think he's been important. I mean, he organised the first Lai Lung protest, basically chase out the uncles protest, which was one of the very early protests in 2020. So I think he's remained important. I think he's kind of taken a lower profile. Since COVID, he's been involved in, I guess, trying to talk about the economy, how to deal with the hardships people dealing with. He's also taken a role in Parliament, getting on, even though he's not a parliamentarian, he's turned up at the budget committee meetings and looked at things like the finances of the monarchy, the proposed purchase for the submarine. I think he's taken a role in. So he is present, but he's only one of many he's one of several key voices now, which I think is, quite healthy in many ways.
Tyrell, did you want to comment on Thanatorn as well?
The only thing I would note is that I think it would be a mistake to think that he or Prayuth or any of the MPs who were disqualified are marginal at all. I would say their significance, and to me, the significance of Future Forward actually isn't correlated. I mean, it's wonderful that they got so many seats in Parliament, but I actually assess their significance as breaking the gridlock in Thai party politics by demonstrating that another way of thinking and doing politics is possible. They campaigned in a different way. They have relations with their constituents that are different, different than any of the previous parties. And so to me, whether they are in Parliament or not, they are very significant in terms of reshaping Thai politics.
There's a question from Shashank Bengali from the Los Angeles Times. How much support do these protests have outside of Bangkok and in the provinces, especially demands for reforms to the monarchy? Tyrell?
Significant support. I mean, I don't know how to assess exactly how much support there is for the the demands, any specific demands, whether just because I'm not there. But what is very striking is that these protests haven't just taken place in Bangkok. They've taken place in Ubon, in Khon Kaen, in Chiang Mai, in Pattani. They're taking place all over the country. And actually there's a fascinating sort of historical moment comparison to this, which is that on the 14th of October, 1973, when there was a mass uprising of people to push out 15 years of military dictatorship, the story everybody knows is when people filled the streets in Bangkok. But actually on that day, in almost every one of Thailand's 70 plus provinces, there were protests. And this, I think, is quite similar. This is not only a Bangkok protest. Something else just in this vein that I would note is that in one of the mid-August protests in Bangkok that was held at the Democracy Monument, there was a group of student activists from Pattani who got up on the stage and spoke also. This was also incredibly significant because it was a moment where concerns about dispossession and a long period of emergency rule in southern Thailand became present, not at a protest just about what was going on in southern Thailand, but were part of a national protest around democracy. So I think you see, in a sense, you see, again, maybe this is we could talk about this in terms of the horizontal nature of these protests. It's not even sort of from the capital to the provinces or the provinces to the capital. It's that this protest is taking place in the capital and in the provinces.
Yeah, I'll just add one point to that, and it is so critical to realise that these are geographically decentered protests, but there hasn't been the kind of division, I don't think, between the north and northeast, which were, Thaksin red shirt strongholds, and the south, which were, Democrat or royalist strongholds. I don't think that phenomenon is really present here. I think there's protests happening in the southern provinces as well as, and Tyrell's mentioned Pattani. So, I think, that really just distinguishes this protest movement from the previous set of protests.
There's a question from Ken Lohata Penant about the upcoming change in command of the Royal Thai Army. General Apirat is scheduled to step down soon and to be replaced by General Narongpan. Greg, can you tell us a little bit about what this signals about shifts within the RTA, whether or not the RTA might take a different approach to the protests or to foreign policy issues as a result of that? And there's some other questions I've noticed about General Apirat and his stated willingness to launch a coup if need be, and of course his father's history with coups. Could you speak a little bit about him and how you see his future developing in Thai politics?
The succession is important, I think, particularly from the point of view that the successor to Apirat, Narongpan, is reputedly not particularly close to General Prayuth. So I think, that suggests the possibility of this pattern of military dictators becoming civilian politicians, then losing the support of the military, then being ousted by another generation of military leaders. And we've seen that sort of script many times in Thailand. I think, the other thing about Narongpan is that he is very close to the palace. He's a member of the, I guess, this select group that wear a red T-shirt to indicate that they are in the Ratcha 1904 group, and like General Apirat. So his selection is likely to have been with the approval of the palace, almost doubtlessly with the approval of the palace, and that's also important. General Apirat, what his future holds is interesting. Some Thai dictators, some coup makers like Sonti Bunyaratiklin have kind of just disappeared after really being colossal figures in Thai politics. They really don't transition very well to civilian life. I don't know what General Apirat has in mind for his future career. It's been interesting. Last week, I think he tried to I guess, walk back some of his criticism of the protesters and start to at least also allow for the possibility of constitutional change, which we haven't talked about much. What are the pathways for constitutional change? And I think that's a really important question. But I do think, you know, what we might see in terms of transition has implications if we had a crisis which, you know, did involve bloodshed, and then there's a demand to look for some way for diffusing that. Now, in 1973, 1992, that was done when there was a royal audience with, you know, leaders of the opposing forces. Now, I don't know if we'd see that this time, but we certainly would see probably machinations behind the scene to try and find a new prime minister. And Prayuth could quickly find himself without any friends. I think his, you know, if those blocks of votes like the Democrats and Phumjai Thai were persuaded to move to a new candidate, they could probably find someone like the leader of Phumjai Thai, Anutin, who might well be acceptable to the palace. And we could kind of see an engineering of a political outcome such as we saw in 2008 when we suddenly saw Apisit elected without actually an election. There was simply a shift of a block of votes. And I think that kind of scenario is still possible. Again, I don't think that would actually solve the problem of the protest, but it could be a kind of interim solution to release a bit of pressure. And I think that is possible now that Prayuth and also his colleagues, Anupong Pauchinda and Prawit Wongsuwon, as they lose traction, they lose control of the military with each passing, you know, promotional round. That becomes a possible scenario for the future.
Tyrell, did you want to add something on the party politics in Parliament, Phumjai Thai and Anutin, or the possibility of changing coalitions within Parliament?
The only thing I would add is that it was very clear during the lead up to the 2019 elections and then afterwards that for some party politicians, ideology is very flexible. So I would just say this is a moment where we could see shifts. I don't know what they would be. I think it's too soon to make any predictions, but I was very surprised at the flexibility and ease with which parties, as well as certainly individual politicians, quickly went over to support Palang Pracharat. So I think if they can switch that way, particularly quickly, they could switch in another direction potentially quickly as well. But the factors that would need to come into place for that to happen, I think we'd have to wait and see.
A question from Clara Ferreira Marquez from Bloomberg. Could you elaborate on the challenge to the Thai education system? What change can we realistically expect? How does it connect with the need for wider labor reform to improve productivity and competitiveness? Tyrell?
That is a great question. Particularly the point about what can we realistically see. Because of course, I mean, changing the way in which the education system operates, which Greg did a great job of elaborating how it works, is an enormous undertaking, because the kind of hierarchy and forced deference to authority that starts in kindergarten continues up through universities. So undoing that is very difficult. I think at the same time, I have been very, very pleasantly surprised and quite, actually, to be honest, quite moved watching the responses of some school principals who have reacted positively to the questions and protests of secondary school students. I mean, primary school students have been protesting also. That to me suggests that change is possible. I think where it ties to broader questions of labor reform is that, you know, one of the arguments that could be made for why shifts in education and why breaking down some of the really strong hierarchy and forced deference to authority is important is to increase creativity, as to, you know, sort of the arguments about that, that making education more creative and critical is going to lead to new kinds of industries, new kinds of technologies. I think that's very compelling. I also think in terms of trying to assess how much change is actually possible, I think, again, the breadth of the call from students. This isn't just students at a few elite high schools in Bangkok. You know, the protests started at elite public high schools in Bangkok, schools that you have to do very well on a standard exam to get into, but they're now taking place throughout the country. And so I think that schools and ultimately the Ministry of Education, where students have also directed their demands, will have to respond. You know, if you have 2,000 students in your school who are all protesting before they come into school in the morning, you have to respond. There's their hand is forced. Just one other note I would make is that something that makes these protests different and significant and fascinating, you know, intellectually, politically, et cetera, is that the demands for change, both in terms of the education system as well as the political system, are coming from people who their reasons for calling for change are their direct experience in them. And so I think that means that the students who are calling for changes in their schools and the broader education system are unlikely to stop asking for those changes because they're thinking about their own educational trajectory and they want a different education, and they're willing to, you know, to put time, energy, and their, you know, their own futures on the line for it.
Greg, was there anything you wanted to add on some of these broader social, because this is not just a movement for political reform, it is a broader social movement at this point. How do you see that playing out? How do you see the politics of that playing out?
Yeah, it is encompassing things as seemingly trivial as the wearing of school uniforms and haircuts. I mean, they've become issues, real issues for students. But
maybe can you just explain for those who are not familiar what that's about, the haircut in particular?
Okay, well, you know, university students at Chulalongkorn, for example, are still required to wear a uniform, for girls at secondary schools, they're all required to have a uniform kind of bob cut, and you know, this is kind of rigorously enforced at a lot of schools, and I think students are tired of that focus on externalities. Meanwhile, they're not getting a high quality education. One anecdote I'm aware of at Jular, actually, and I'll come back to Jular for a different reason in a moment, but there was a lecturer who was notorious for turning up late to his classes, and then, you know, in the stream that he was teaching, the students would be given an exam that was 100% multiple choice questions, so not writing essays, you know, and this was, you know, international relations actually, so that is not, you know, is not really adequate for the kind of jobs of the future, and not even for the jobs of the present, frankly. But you know, and I think it's been, you know, understood for some time in Thailand that the middle income trap can't be solved simply by hard infrastructure. It can't be solved simply by building, you know, more connective infrastructure between, you know, Don Mueang and Bangkok and Utapao. I think they need to do more, and part of that is, you know, the thinking skills and the human resource of the country. And I think it's been understood for some time that the Thai education system's a roadblock. The union, the teacher union, and in some ways is a roadblock, hasn't permitted reform. And I think there's an awareness even in the Thai government now that that needs to change, and some initiatives are occurring. But just one last point on Chulalongkorn. I think it was interesting that everyone knows Thammasat is the hotbed of radicalism. It's always been the place where progressive, I guess often left-wing protest has been based. But Chulalongkorn has also been involved in these protests. And Chulalongkorn is, you know, the children of the elite, and it's often been a more conservative university campus, but they have been also staging protests, and I think that's an indication of the breadth of the protest movement.
Yeah, that is really interesting. We have time for just one more question, perhaps two more questions, if we can do them quickly. Hunter Marston from the ANU asks, how do the speakers read the latest postponement of the Chinese submarine purchase? According to Sebastian Strangio, the hashtag people say no to subs was trending on Twitter. What is the connection between protesters and Thai foreign policy? Greg, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, quickly. I mean, the submarines, it's interesting. initially, after COVID hit and it was clear that the economy was going to take a hit, there was a statement from the government that they would be suspending a lot of procurement. So it was somewhat surprising when, to hear that the acquisition of the remaining 2 submarines, because they've already purchased one, was going to proceed. I think this was always optimistic. The Thai Navy's had a mammoth task to convince people of the worth of investing in submarines, and I guess its history, it's rather sorry history in some of its past investments, which have not delivered much. The aircraft carrier Chakre Narubet, unfortunately, purchased in 1997, these days is largely a sort of tourist attraction at the wharf at Sattahip. It doesn't go out very often, and I think people look at that as a white elephant, and they think at a time like this, why would you be sending, putting another 4 billion baht into, well, that's only the first tranche of 7 tranches or something, but why do it? So the timing was just appalling, and I think it was inevitable that they would bow to the public pressure. All they've done though is delayed it another year, so it's still on the cards. Look, Thai militaries have always sought to build the budget up after coups. That's been a pattern of history. And sometimes I would say that there's some legitimacy. I mean, after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the budget didn't move for 15 years, and a military has to run down under those conditions. But of course, the major problem the Thai military has is justifying their role, and they don't do it, and they don't build a constituency for people who really understand the role of the military under civil control or as a support to national interest. They are too involved in politics and too involved, and they have not subjected themselves to any reforms, so that they lack credibility in trying to explain the legitimate defence needs of the country.
Tyrell, there's a great question. I'm not sure that we have time to cover it in the full at the full length that it deserves. But just on the question of the media and how the media landscape in Thailand has shaped the protest and what people are able to learn about the protest, could you give us a sort of a very brief overview of how that's played a role?
Absolutely. And I'll start by sharing an anecdote that I spoke to a friend in Bangkok this morning who said that she has stopped watching TV during the protest, TV news during the protest weeks, because there's much better coverage being provided live by those at the protest. TV isn't getting there quick enough. So I would say a couple of things. One is that this is a moment where citizen journalism is expanding significantly and rapidly. And so the best coverage of these protests, all of which are live streamed, is being done by the protests themselves or by those who are present. That is fascinating. The other thing, I guess there's 2 important media points to make. One is that prior to the coup, there were only, I would say, a handful of really big independent online media outlets. From about 2015 on, they expanded dramatically in providing both news coverage as well as commentary, and in creating space for a lot of all sorts of political views to come to the fore. So I think that's been significant in terms of giving protesters, it's another source of knowledge and information through which the ideas that are in the streets have come to the fore. There has been, the Prayuth government has been clear in sending signals to mainstream media not to cover some of the protests that are taking place or the contents of the demands. I applaud the effort, but precisely because the social media is so powerful in Thailand as well as other places, even if newspapers and television stations are discouraged from covering protests or dissent, Twitter and Facebook are so powerful and so accessible that it won't be successful, I guess is what I would say.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And thanks to both of you for joining us. I know it's very late in Madison, Wisconsin. And thanks to everyone who was able to join. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but I'd encourage you to read Greg and Tyrell's work in the coming days and Greg's book, which I have behind me. Tyrell, I'm sorry, I don't have a display copy of yours for more on what's happening in Thailand, because this is such an interesting time in Thailand, and I think really is different from some of the previous political turmoil that we've seen in previous years. So thank you both for joining us, and thank you everyone who tuned in.
Thanks, Aaron.